iGlobenews brings global views.
Welcome to our weekly podcast series, iGlobenews, where we discuss world politics and current events. My name is Diana Mautner-Markov. I'm editor-in-chief of iGlobenews.org, and joining me today is Professor Gerhard Mangot, University Professor of Political Science at the University of Innsbruck in the lovely Austrian province of Tyrol. He is a top specialist on international relations and security in the post-Soviet region. Please remember to like and follow. Today we will be discussing, does Europe's future depend on Ukraine, or is there a larger dimension? And for the record, this session was recorded on July 22nd, 2026. The war in Ukraine, or as Russia calls it, the special military operation, is raging into its fifth year. Both Russia and Ukraine continue to go up the escalation ladder. The Western media have not reported truthfully about the war. We do not know how many have died on the Ukrainian side. Also, the reported deaths on the Russian side vary widely from 400,000 to over 1 million. Do you have any information as to the state on the battlefield? Which side is winning the war, or are there only losers at this point?
Well, at the end of the day, there are only losers. But as the current situation in the military clash is concerned, I can say that Ukraine is still defending the frontier lines. So in the region of Donetsk, Russia's onslaught on the defense cities like Kostiantynivka, Drushkivka, or Sloviansk and Kramatorsk has been slowed down. Russia's gains in terms of territory have been limited to about 13 square miles in the past 4 weeks, so that's not very much. And this is due to the fact that the Ukrainian side is very efficient in FPV drones, killing Russian soldiers who try to infiltrate cities and villages. So in this respect, Ukraine is quite successful in halting the Russian advance. Ukraine is also very successful now that it has employed middle-range drones, so-called Hornets, with a range of 300 kilometers at large. And with this, Ukraine has been able to destroy much of Russia's logistics on the peninsula of Crimea, but also the logistics of supply to the Russian frontier soldiers. So in this respect, Ukraine has been very successful. And finally, in the air war, we have, so to speak, a Ukrainian armed force which is able to penetrate sites deep inside of Russia, oil refineries, ports, and other infrastructure elements. Whereas on the other side, Russia is able to clash with the Ukrainian side with its ballistic missiles, also its cruise missiles and its glide bombs and drones, because Ukraine doesn't have proper air defense at the moment. The only air defense which can help against ballistic missiles is the Patriot 3 system of the United States. And here the Ukraine does have such systems, but not interceptors they would need to use these systems. So on the soil, we can say Russia's advance has been halted, not completely, but very much. In the air war, we have to say both sides can hurt each other very much.
I think it was at the recent NATO summit where Zelensky also took part on the sidelines. He got a concession from President Trump saying that Patriot missiles will in the future be able to be produced in Ukraine. I think that would be a great advantage for Ukraine. But of course, until he gets to the point where he's actually producing these missiles, a lot of time would pass. Russia claims that Europe is now involved in the war and European targets are legitimate. Do you envisage any scenario where Russia would escalate the war, maybe even use a nuclear weapon if it feels threatened in its existence? Will Russia start bombing NATO targets, for instance, weapons manufacturing plants in Germany? And how worried should we be in Europe that we will be drawn into a full-scale war with Russia?
Well, the Russians have responded to the Ukrainian attacks made possible by Western technology with saying that they will escalate the war. To a certain extent, they have already done so. They could escalate even further in the war against Ukraine, but they could escalate, of course, also if they start to hit targets in NATO countries. NATO countries are supplying Ukraine with weapons. This, under international law, does not make them a war party. But from a political science point of view, we can say, yes, NATO or Europe so to speak, is at war with Russia, both in a hybrid war, but also in the sense of a kinetic war with regard to the arms deliveries, the weapons deliveries, the munition deliveries of NATO and the European Union to Ukraine. I don't think that the use of nuclear weapons, tactical or sub-strategic nuclear weapons, is very likely. This will only be the last resort. Russia has been warned not to do so by the US. The US threatening a huge conventional counterstrike, eliminating Russian armed forces or large parts of Russian armed forces. But Russia has also been warned by China and India, countries which are close to the Russian leadership. They have all told the Russians that the use of nuclear weapons is actually unacceptable. It will break a nuclear taboo which has existed for more than 80 years now. As far as strikes against NATO countries or arms companies in NATO countries are concerned, I think this is a possibility, not a very likely possibility. But if Russia gets more and more in the defense in this war against Ukraine, particularly on the soil, such strikes are to be considered possible.
Putin did give a late-night interview on June 30th to a Russian journalist. He addressed Russia's growing fuel shortages, which were caused by Ukraine's targeting of Russia's energy infrastructure. This seems to be the West's strategy: hit the energy infrastructure, create great economic unrest, and then people will rise up and overthrow Vladimir Putin. But as we see in Iran, that strategy seems to have failed there. According to a survey by the Russian Public Opinion Research Center, VCIOM, Putin's approval rating has fallen to the lowest since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. Yet this overall approval still sits at 65.1%, an approval rating President Trump or any other Western leader would be very proud of. What is, in your opinion, the resilience of Putin to survive this war and beyond? Is his position as president of Russia in any way under threat, as the West is constantly saying? And will the West's plan of targeting Russian energy topple Putin?
Well, the support rate or the trust rates of Vladimir Putin are still high, but they are declining. You're absolutely right. The Levada Institute has public support for Putin's leadership at about 75%, Tsiom, which you just cited, at 66%, which is much lower than the support rate Putin enjoyed over the past 4 years, which was well beyond 80%. If we compare Putin's trust rates and support rates with that of Western politicians, we of course have to say that doing research in a repressive environment is difficult. So maybe we should not trust that much in absolute numbers, but believe in trends that various polling institutes tell us. Maybe we can also say that many people, because of the repressive environment, don't say the truth. They tell the pollsters what they think the leadership wants to hear. But in general, we can assume that a majority of Russia's population indeed is still backing Vladimir Putin as president. And the most important thing about the public trust and support rates is that Vladimir Putin does not have to fear a revolt from the bottom. So mass unrest, even under the current conditions of aerial attacks on Russian cities, aerial attacks on Russian energy infrastructure and logistics centers. Even in such a situation, even with these restrictions of the deliverability of diesel and gasoline, the public distrust or the public lack of confidence in the leadership will not be a threatening issue for Vladimir Putin. Why is that the case? Because due to the repressive decisions and actions taken by the Russian government over the past 10 years, there's almost no leading figure of the opposition left who could mobilize or organize this public discontent. Many of them have been forced into exile. Many of them are in jail. Some have even died, as Alexei Navalny in jail. So from the bottom, there's no real threat to the rule of Vladimir Putin. However, among the elites, we see that some are asking whether it's worth to continue the war, given the costs of this war, both in terms of human lives and financial resources and technological resources. But I do not think that Putin's position will be threatened even by the elite, as long as there is no catastrophic defeat of the Russian armed forces in Ukraine. say if Russia would lose Crimea, which is a very unlikely scenario, Putin's position would be really threatened. But this is not the case and will most likely not be the case. So I think Putin's ouster will depend on a very drastic defeat of Russia's armed forces in Ukraine. And as I've said, we are not there yet.
Do you think that Russia could be defeated?
I don't think so. I mean, of course, the Ukrainian side can destroy a lot of logistics and supply routes, bridges, and what have you in the rear part of the Ukrainian front. However, what the Ukrainian armed forces cannot do is liberate occupied territory, Russian occupied territory, because they don't have the manpower to go into the offensive. If an armed force goes into the offensive, then it has to have manpower at least 3 times or 4 times higher than the defender. And one of the great problems of Ukraine is that it doesn't have enough manpower, that it cannot recruit as many soldiers as it would need. So I think what is possible is that the Russians would eventually give in and accept the current line on the front and accept a ceasefire. But I don't see that Ukraine can win this war. But you know, for Russia as the attacker, it's important that they win the war. For Ukraine, it's only important not to lose the war. And that's a major difference for the two sides. And in this respect, I can argue, or I want to argue, that Ukraine is in a position not to lose the war.
Very interesting. Thank you for that insight. But of course, President Zelensky, if we want to turn from Putin now to Zelensky, has also been consistently reshuffling his government. He has announced that he will replace Prime Minister Yulia Sviridenko, who didn't even last a year in office, and she now might possibly become the new U.S. ambassador. This latest call by Zelensky has been unexpected, even for those familiar with Ukrainian politics. Zelensky also just dismissed the very popular defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov. Fedorov was praised for energizing the defense ministry and for transforming the armed forces, as well as leading a drive against corruption. And just this week, he appointed Mikhail Drapati as the new commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian army to replace Alexander Syrsky. Drapati is a popular, battle-hardened general, whereas the former commander-in-chief, Syrsky, is seen by many in Ukraine as a Soviet school commander, reluctant to implement any radical changes in the army. So Ukraine's president is under pressure from the U.S. to take his country to the poll as soon as possible, with President Donald Trump demanding elections as a condition for American security guarantees for Ukraine against any future Russian invasion. So, are these constant rotations in Zelensky's government connected to the upcoming elections? Is Zelensky preparing for the elections by removing any uncomfortable rivals? How popular is Zelensky's government, and why is Zelensky constantly sacking ministers?
Well, all these reshuffles in the administration of the president, and particularly in the government, are meant to signal to the Ukrainian public that change is happening. Because, you know, we have not had elections since 7 years now, and Zelensky has remained in power for those 7 years and will most likely remain in power for a couple of months or maybe years. So people are dissatisfied with this situation when there is no change in leadership. With government reshuffles, Zelensky wants to signal to the public, of course, we do have renewal, we do have changes, we do respond to the current situation on the front line, we do respond to the demands of the Ukrainian society. So it's some sort of show of change that Zelensky needs to put on the stage. As far as Drapati is concerned, he is a Ukrainian, unlike Syrsky, who was born in Russia and is often considered by many Ukrainians as a Russian. And Drapati is a Ukrainian, is much younger. It's a new generation, 43 years old. And he has been quite successful in his military career over the past years, particularly in the defense of Kiev at the beginning of this full onslaught of Russia on Ukraine, but also in the recapturing of much of the region of Kharkiv. And he is open to new technology, which is actually what the dismissed defense minister Fedorov was very keen about to introduce into the activities and the war fighting of the Ukrainian armed forces. The big question, however, will be who is going to be the new defense minister. I mean, the fact that Zelensky felt pressured by street demonstrations to sack Alexander Syrsky is a sign of weakness. if he would reappoint Fedorov to the post of defense minister, this would be an ultimate sign of weakness, and actually Zelensky cannot afford. He would lose face. So it's not very likely that Fedorov will become defense minister again. It might be someone else like Mr. Kmara that Zelensky has so far proposed for the post of defense minister. However, a dream team would be Drapati and Fedorov, of course, but I don't think it's politically likely because, as I've said, this would mean a loss of face for the Zelensky government. And yes, it's also all connected to forthcoming elections. We don't know when elections will take place. Under the constitution, elections to the parliament are prohibited as long as there is a state of war. Under the law on the state of war, presidential elections are prohibited as long as it lasts. So only if the parliament would change the law on the status of war, elections to the presidency cannot take place. And this will not happen despite US pressure. But Zelensky, of course, is aware that during the war, many figures became publicly known and well supported by the Ukrainian population. There could be a threat for his re-election, like the former commander of the Ukrainian armed forces in Ukraine, General Zaluzhny, or now Mikhail Fedorov, or other people like Kirilo Budanov, who is the head of the presidential administration. So Zelensky has to be careful who he will support in the rise of popularity among his subordinates in order to protect his chances to get re-elected once there will be elections to the presidency again.
Does President Zelensky have the majority in the parliament? In which case, couldn't he change the rules of the game and hold elections even during a war? Because who knows how long this war would last?
Well, his faction, Servants of the People, has gained a very huge majority in the parliamentary elections in Ukraine many years ago. But meanwhile, Zelensky does not really hold a majority in the Verkhovna Rada, in the Ukrainian parliament. He needs to have the support of other factions. So his position in the parliament is weakened. If he would ask the parliament to change the law on martial rule, then he would probably not get a majority, even if he wanted to. Because if there are new presidential elections, there would also be new parliamentary elections, and many of the deputies still want to remain in place, want to keep their seats, and are not keen to have parliamentary elections as soon as possible.
So this brings us to another topic, which I kind of feel that you've already mentioned here, is the corruption. Corruption continues to plague Ukraine. On Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, Ukraine ranks 104th out of 182 countries worldwide. As a reminder, in November 2025, Ukraine was rocked by a multi-million-dollar corruption scandal involving illegal kickbacks, bribery, and money laundering through the state-owned nuclear power company Energoatom. This was uncovered by the Ukrainian corruption watchdogs. High-ranking company officials and former associates of President Volodymyr Zelensky were involved in this scheme, including his powerful chief of staff and closest ally, Andriy Yermak, who was forced to resign. Ukraine's justice and energy ministers also resigned, as did the heads of Energoatom's finance, legal, and procurement departments, as well as a consultant to Energoatom's president. Timur Mindish, a co-owner of Zelensky's Kvartal 95 media production company, is suspected to be the mastermind behind this corruption scheme, and Mindish fled to Israel. The investigation has prompted questions about what the country's highest officials knew about the scheme and reminded the public of Zelensky's efforts to influence Ukraine's anti-corruption watchdogs. The high level of corruption and lack of rule of law is a major stumbling block for Ukraine joining the EU. And the EU just on June 1st has passed the Directive on Combating Corruption, which standardizes the definitions and penalties for bribery, trading in influence, and abuse of office across all member states. So Ukraine has been warned repeatedly by the EU and its leaders that it must crack down on corruption. So how do you see the fight against corruption progressing in Ukraine? In your opinion, is Zelensky himself involved in this corruption? What are Ukraine's chances of EU membership in the near term, keeping this in mind? And what would be the impact on the EU and Europe if Ukraine became a member?
Well, corruption is still a major issue in Ukrainian domestic politics. Corruption is still alive, and the question whether Zelensky personally has been involved in such schemes cannot be answered with certainty. But it's obvious that if people very close to President Zelensky, like Yermak, the head of the presidential administration, or Mindich, the one you have mentioned before, who fled to Israel, if those are involved, it's very difficult to think that Zelensky at least did not have knowledge about these machinations. If he himself is corrupt, we can't say. Some say yes, some say no. There's not any hard evidence to back this or the opposite claim. We have very intensively working anti-corruption institutions like the SAPO, the Special Prosecutor, and an anti-corruption agency, NABA, which do terrific work, who have also actually led the investigations in people like Yermak and Mindich. However, what the problem is in Ukraine, many of those high-level persons are not brought to court because the general procuracy is rather very weak in bringing such cases to the court, and no very prominent corruption politician has been sentenced by a court. So what we have is we have a very serious and powerful investigations, but no punishment for corruption. And that's something which needs to be dealt with by the Ukrainian government when it wants to reform itself so it can get ready for the accession to the European Union. The issue of corruption is currently negotiated after the cluster of fundamentals has been opened in the negotiations between the European Union and Ukraine. The prospect of Ukraine joining the European Union anytime soon are not very, very good. You know, Zelensky initially demanded that Ukraine become a member on January the 1st, 2027. Then he has moved it to 2028. But even in 2028, it's highly unlikely that Ukraine will become a member of the European Union because accession has always been merit-based, meaning that an applicant country needs to accept the acquis communautaire of the European Union, and it has to demonstrate that it is able and willing to implement these legal norms on its own territory. And only then a country can really accede to the European Union. And Ukraine has still a long journey to go in order to meet this criteria. And then if we think about European or EU enlargement, we still have to remember the so-called Copenhagen criteria from 1993, which say the European Union can only or must only get new members if the European Union itself is prepared to absorb new members. And that's also an issue of debate whether the European Union, under the current legal situation of the EU treaty, the Lisbon Treaty, is actually capable of integrating such a large country like Ukraine. Plus, finally, I have to say, many countries in the Western Balkans have been waiting for accession to the European Union many years, some even decades, and it would be very unfair if Ukraine would be given a fast-track accession to the European Union while they had to wait for so long and still have to wait.
Which wouldn't be the first time that Ukraine got special treatment, but it would be unfair if Ukraine would not have to fulfill all the criteria that the others have been forced to fulfill. At the recent NATO summit in Ankara, NATO defense budgets and support for Ukraine topped the agenda, with the alliance pledging 70 billion euros in assistance to Kiev. NATO currently views Russia as its most significant and direct threat following Russia's full-scale war on Ukraine. The alliance has suspended practical cooperation with Russia and reinforced its eastern flank with new regional defense plans. In your opinion, how long will NATO continue to support Ukraine? What is the position of NATO when it comes to a lasting peace in Ukraine, or will NATO continue to fight to the last Ukrainian?
Well, when it comes to the last issue that you've mentioned, many politicians in Europe argue that Ukraine is defending European security. They mean that if the Ukrainians lose the war against Russia, we will be next. Cynically speaking, the Western interest should be that the war in Ukraine lasts for many more years in order to weaken Russia and keep it from attacking NATO countries. So in a cynical way, European security is a result or a function of the length of the current Russian-Ukrainian war. This is just cynically speaking, but there's a lot of truth in it. NATO has pledged to support Ukraine this year with 70 billion euros. The same amount at least should be spent next year. However, we need to be careful. NATO countries will actually provide only about 40 billion euros because 30 billion of those 70 billion are EU money. Of course, many EU states are also NATO states or the other way around, but still it's different organizations. So NATO members will have to mobilize about 40 billion euros this year. Some of the pledges of financial support and military support are actually already part of this calculation. So the new money that NATO members need to mobilize is rather small. I think that NATO and the European Union are committed to support Ukraine even on the long term. The question is whether the Europeans can finance such a policy of continuous support. You know, the EU member states have to deal with two major expenditure fields. The first is to support Ukraine militarily and financially, and the other one is to build its own arms industry and to increase its own defense and deterrence capability. That, of course, costs a lot of money, and we need to debate where the money should come from. Tax raises, not very popular with the European populations. Cuts in social spending, even less popular with European populations. And the other chance to finance this long-term support is to issue new debt. This is possible for countries like Germany, of course, but it's not possible for countries like France or Spain, who have a very high budget deficit and a very high state debt. So it remains to be seen whether there will be money available for this policy of continued support of Ukraine. A way to overcome these difficulties of the financial situation of some EU members would be to issue joint debt of the European Union. But in this regard, Germany is very much against doing so. That is a major issue, how to finance the support over the next 1, 2, 3 or more years of war in Ukraine.
And the EU also used Russian sovereign assets and is trying to use the interest from those assets to finance the war in Ukraine or to finance the buildup of Ukraine. But of course, Russia has been fighting this. And the question is, if the war ends and Russia then fights this in the courts, would Russia win?
Well, not in European courts, and Europeans don't recognize Russian courts' decisions in this respect. However, we need to remember that it was Chancellor Merz who in September of last year pressed for the European Union not only to freeze Russian assets, but to confiscate them in order to finance Ukrainian needs both financially and militarily. But there has been no consensus, or no consensus has been reached since then. On the European Council in December last year, this was rejected because of serious concerns what impact this might have on the EU as a financial market and on the various countries who would then confiscate Russian assets. So I don't think that any time in the future or in the immediate future there will be a change of position on behalf of those EU countries who have opposed confiscating Russian assets. So I don't think this source will be available for financing the long-term support policy of the European Union.
I think Belgium especially was against this, as far as I remember.
France as well.
France as well, yes. Now I want to bring in another aspect, namely Russia's Arctic policy. Russia views the far north as its premier strategic and economic priority, focusing heavily on militarization of its northern sea route and deterring NATO expansion. Moscow has warned against the militarization of Greenland, frequently using Europe and European ambitions there as a leverage to exploit NATO divisions and asserts its own regional dominance. While China is not an Arctic nation by geography, Beijing officially refers to itself as a near Arctic state and holds a coveted permanent observer status on the Arctic Council. At the NATO summit, Trump reiterated his desire to claim Greenland for the U.S. So how will this divide within NATO members affect their support for Ukraine? Will Russia profit from this situation? And will NATO and the EU back down regarding Greenland?
Well, Donald Trump's blatant, aggressive remarks that the US might seize Greenland even militarily has deeply divided NATO countries, particularly the European Union, the European member countries and the US. This is, of course, profitable to Russia. Any division of NATO is of great advantage to Russia, not only to Russian propaganda, but in real terms. And also Trump's various utterances that NATO members might not be protected by the United States in case of a Russian attack have undermined the capabilities of NATO and particularly the credibility of NATO. So actually, the fact that NATO is now divided over Greenland is due to American decisions and due to American actions, not to Russian actions, but Russia profits from it, of course. As far as the militarization of Greenland is concerned, there's a treaty between the Kingdom of Denmark and the United States from 1951 that the United States is allowed to open new military bases on the territory of Greenland, more than they have at the moment. So this is a bilateral agreement between the two countries, and Russia can call for preventing militarization, but they cannot prevent it. It's beyond their legal realm. So this might happen anyway. But the question is if Donald Trump will be satisfied with opening new military bases at Greenland. He still claims that it would be best for the United States to take over Greenland. If the United States takes over Greenland, as I said, it's not just a threat to the credibility and the coherence of NATO, but it also would speed up the militarization of the Arctic area, with the Russians investing even more, the Chinese getting involved in the militarization of the Arctic, and that would be a very negative development for European security.
And in that sense, would it also negatively impact Ukraine because resources would be diverted to fighting a race in the Arctic?
Well, sure. As I said before, resources are limited. If there is a new field of engagement by European countries in militarizing the Arctic or preventing Russia and China from gaining the dominance in the Arctic region, this would mean resources have to be sent to the defense of the Arctic or their own militarization as a counterforce to Russian and Chinese militarization. And these resources, who are limited, will then, of course, fail to be sent to Ukraine. They would be missing in the support of Ukraine. In a nutshell, we can say this initiative by Donald Trump about Greenland has been a very stupid initiative that he has started.
And of course, resources are limited. The Europeans so far have backed Ukraine with over 216 billion in financial, military, and humanitarian support since 2022. And many people are saying that there's this kind of Ukraine fatigue, which is slowly setting in Europe. We know that Ukraine is no longer headline news with the Iran war in its hot phase, and it doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon. And also many Europeans now are really feeling the crunch. Energy prices, which have risen first with the war in Ukraine, again spiked and are continuing to spike with the war in Iran. Does the EU really want peace, or is it a driver of the war in Ukraine, which is kind of, you've already mentioned that it's in the security interest of Europe to keep on fighting this war, because the idea is as long as it's fighting a war against Ukraine, Russia won't attack Europe. But everyone is asking, when will Europe start talking to Russia again?
Well, the European Union does not have a common position on when to negotiate with Russia, who should negotiate with Russia, and about what the Europeans should negotiate with Russia. So the European Union is still in the process of getting an answer to all these three issues, to these three questions. And this obviously, as it seems, takes a lot of time. If the United States continues with its mediation, with the trilateral talks between Russia, Ukraine, and the US, it would be positive for the European side if they would nominate a negotiator who could sit on the table of these trilateral talks, making them quadrilateral talks. If the US actually stops mediating in this conflict, then the European Union needs to decide whether to continue supporting Ukraine, to continue with the war, to keep Russia actually limited in its ambitions to attack European countries, or if they start negotiations with the Russian side. And as far as I can see, in the European Union, there's no readiness to negotiate with the Russians about how the war in Russia should end, or at least even if there would be such a consensus, the demands that the European Union is raising together with the Ukrainian leadership as part of a lasting and just peace are not acceptable to the Russian side. So I don't think that the Europeans could play a role without the United States in bringing this war to an end. the only chance that they have is to negotiate with the United States, with the two warring parties.
And of course, when President Trump came to power, he claimed he was going to solve the Ukraine war in 24 hours. Well, that obviously didn't happen. And he, as you mentioned, he had these various rounds of trilateral negotiations, and he did try to bring the war to an end, but it didn't work out. Was this because Trump was too Putin friendly, or were there other reasons? But could it be that neither Russia nor Ukraine want to end the war at the moment?
Well, the last remark is actually correct. Neither Ukraine nor Russia want to stop the war because both sides are still convinced that they can win the war, at least to a certain extent. I don't think that Trump is very much Russia friendly. Sometimes yes, but in principle, I don't think that he's too Russia friendly. He's definitely not a Russian asset, as some observers claim. However, the problem with Donald Trump and with his chief negotiators, Witkoff and Kushner, is that they don't know the dossier very well. And if a mediator is not up to the task of understanding what the bone of contentions are in the negotiations about bringing the war to an end, then such mediation missions are bound to fail. And that's what we see at the moment. The point is, at the meeting of the G7 in Evian in the mid of June, Trump seemed to increase his support for the Ukrainian side. He encouraged Zelensky to be even more aggressive in the fight against Russian infrastructure on Russian territory. And it remains to be seen whether this will be the same in 2, 3, or 4 months. We have to wait and see. But at the moment, I don't see that Trump is very keen of supporting Russian demands in these negotiations about a peace resolution. So, no, I don't think he's a Russian asset, and I don't think he's too Russia-friendly. The only thing I'm absolutely sure about, he's not competent enough to handle the issue.
Well, this is the same dream team that's been handling the negotiations in Iran, and they haven't been too successful there, which is why President Trump then ended up sending J.D. Vance over there. But then there are, of course, other reasons why that hasn't been going too well, mainly Israel continuing to bomb Lebanon. That's a different issue. I wanted to talk about a development which I came across, and I wanted to ask your opinion. In Germany, there's been a really interesting new alliance or possible alliance, which has been in the news, namely the AfD, which is, of course, the right-wing Alternative für Deutschland, now actively discussing with the BSW, which is Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, which is a left party, to come together after an election. So the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht has said it's not going to keep up this wall, this Randmauer, as we say in German, against the AfD, which all the other parties have so far stuck to, keeping the AfD more or less out of power in German politics. The BSW has taken a pragmatic approach. If the AfD and the BSW are united, then the AfD could come to power. These two parties are united not on every issue, but they do have common positions on Ukraine, Russia, and immigration. In the state elections in September, which will take place in Sachsen-Anhalt and in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, in both of those states, the AfD has greatly increased in all recent polls. So in Saxony, it's at 41%. In Mecklenburg, it's at 36%. And if the BSW would gain votes from, say, the Socialists or from Die Linke, then it is not out of the realm of possibility that actually they could win those elections and be the premier force in those two provinces in Germany. But what does this shift in policy towards the AfD mean for Germany? And will such a shift also take place in other European countries? This would mean a really new approach towards Russia and to Ukraine, which might be happening sooner than people expect.
I think the outreach of the BSW to the AfD is limited only to those Eastern German countries who will have elections in a couple of months. I don't think it's a strategic alliance that will form on the federal level. And it remains to be seen if the Sarah Wagenknecht party will be able to enter the regional councils of these two states of the Federal Republic of Germany. It's not sure. They are currently at about 4 to 7%. And it remains to be seen whether they will be able to enter these regional parliaments. And only then there would be the issue of whether or not the BSW actually wants to cooperate with the AfD. But it's not something that the BSW actually envisions for the federal level. So I don't see that there will be some sort of alignment of these two parties on the federal level when we will have federal elections. The problem with Germany is the decline of the Social Democrats, which is very serious. And the question is if the CDU will not remain the strongest party in Germany after new elections, who will they be able to form a coalition with? It would not be sufficient to form a coalition with the Social Democrats. They needed to include the Greens. This would make a three-party government, which is highly unpopular among Germans. And there could be the temptation on some parts of the conservatives to give up this cordon sanitaire and start to cooperate with AfD also on the federal level. So I think the greater threat is that the conservatives may join AfD in governing Germany than the leftists.
And this, of course, does not only apply to Germany. We have Marine Le Pen in France. We have in Austria the FPÖ. It's everywhere. There are movements like this which are getting stronger and which is showing maybe that people are unhappy with their government.
People are unhappy, but there's no single trend towards right-wing parties. Yes, in Austria, the FPÖ would win parliamentary elections decisively. In Germany, AfD is currently the strongest party according to the opinion polls. But we have seen other examples where right-wing parties have failed ultimately. Hungary, the Netherlands, when you think about Orban and Geert Wilders. But the major issue, of course, of next year will be who will win the presidential elections of France. Will it be Marine Le Pen? Will it be someone else? Will it be the Rassemblement National who takes over the presidency? This, of course, would mean a major shift in EU policies, not only vis-à-vis Ukraine and Russia, but in all the other matters that are of importance to France. So this is the real challenge. But I want to say there's no unique trend towards right-wing parties, as we have cases where they won and cases where they lost votes.
Many people are moving way to the left also. So it's moving
Yes.
away from the center to the right and to the left. Many observers have stated that Russia has profited from the ongoing war in Iran, with global oil and gas supplies running low and shipments coming out of the Middle East almost at a standstill because the Strait of Hormuz was first blocked by Iran and then blocked by the US. Energy prices have soared. Russia is an ally of Iran, but has been keeping a low profile. And Trump has now announced that he's going to reinstall the sanctions on Russian energy, which he had temporarily lifted at the beginning of the war with Iran. So has the war in Iran affected Russia? How has it affected Russia? Will Russia become more involved in the Middle East as the war seems to sadly be continuing? Has Russia really benefited from this war, as many are saying in the media? And what are the implications for the war in Ukraine?
Well, one of the major benefits of Russia of the Iran war is that the United States is involved in a war which they are not able to bring to an end. For the United States, this war against Iran could be a quagmire in the foreseeable future. And that is positive for the Russians because the United States would be seriously weakened, not only in the Middle East, but globally as far as its standing is concerned. And it will have repercussions inside of the United States, particularly in the midterm elections in the fall. Russia has been profiting, as you've said, from higher oil prices. The prices have gone down after Iran and the United States reached a preliminary agreement in the mid of June, but now prices are on the rise again. Current prices for Brent oil stand at $94 and continue to rise. So this helps Russia to increase the amount of money they can get from oil exports and gas exports. What is also true is that we have already mentioned that the United States has used a lot of Tomahawk cruise missiles and a lot of Patriot interceptors in the war against Iran. So there is a lack of these two weapons in the United States. We think that the United States has about 4,000 Tomahawks, and they may have used more than 1,000 in the Iran war. So if the Iran war would be over someday, the United States would have to invest a lot in both Tomahawks and Patriot interceptors to rearm themselves and to rearm its allies in the Gulf, and also, of course, its Israeli ally. This means that these weapons will not be available for Ukraine for a long time. And in this respect, the war of the US against Iran and the use of so much weaponry of the US is a positive for the Russian Federation. We also have to say if the Iran war will heat up again to an all-out war, media and political attention will be moved from Ukraine to Iran, as it has happened already to a very large extent, and that's also positive for the Russian side. Negative for the Russian side is that as long as the war of the US against Iran continues, Donald Trump is unlikely to re-engage in those trilateral negotiations about solving the Ukrainian war. And Russia is very much dependent on this US engagement, because if the Europeans would replace the United States, that would be very detrimental to Russian interests as far as a peace agreement is concerned. So in this respect, the Russians are negatively affected by the ongoing war.
But now that the US is so focused on the Middle East, as you just said, the prognosis for an end to the war maybe has shifted further into the future. In your opinion, how long do you think this war could go on, and what scenario could actually lead to an end to the war?
Well, actually, I think there's a division in the leadership of Iran between those who have negotiated with the US this memorandum of understanding of mid-June, and the major figures of the Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran. They insist of continuing to fight, and they think that they can fight successfully against the United States if the United States attacks Iran even more aggressively, attacking bridges, infrastructure, desalination infrastructure, for instance, or energy infrastructure. Then they will definitely attack Saudi oil pipelines. They will attack Gulf countries' desalination infrastructure. They will attack Gulf energy infrastructure, and this would hurt the US allies in the region very much, and that could undermine the trust these countries have in the ability and the willingness of the United States to defend these countries, which has already happened because it has been visible that the United States was incapable of protecting its allies in the Gulf. So an escalation is in the interest of the Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran, and actually they will determine if the war ends with a negotiated result or with a military defeat of the United States.
So one of the reasons Russia says it started this war was because of NATO's eastward expansion, which was also driven by the Baltic states. And of course, NATO did expand into the east, right up to the borders of Russia. So the question is, if it comes to a peace at some point, or just the conflict gets frozen, what side would have to make more concessions? Would Europe and Ukraine be forced to make concessions? Will Russia be forced to make concessions? You have a lot of knowledge here. What is your opinion how this war could end and how a final solution could look like?
Well, it of course very much depends on the status of the war once negotiations will be started on how to end it and to bring it to an end. What I think is absolutely unacceptable for the Russian side is NATO membership for Ukraine. And what is unacceptable for the Russian side is the presence of European troops of the coalition of the willing on the territory of Ukraine. These are red lines that the Russians will defend fiercely. And only if they are very much in the defensive militarily, there could be some sort of compromise agreement. I think from the very start it has been wrong to offer Ukraine membership in the alliance, particularly when everybody was well informed that there was no consensus in the alliance about membership of Ukraine in NATO, and there's still no consensus about it. But the decision in 2008 actually was a decision which made Russia pursue a more militaristic foreign policy. And I would say that the full-scale war of Russia against Ukraine is also partly due to the NATO enlargement policy. A lot of my colleagues say this has not played a role, but even the former General Secretary of NATO has said it played a role when he stated in February 2024 that one of the ambitions of Russia to wage this war has been to close the door for Ukraine to NATO. So he himself admitted that this is an issue in the current war. It's not the only issue, maybe not the most important issue, but it's an issue. And I think if there will be an agreement, this issue of Ukrainian membership should be put off the table.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your insight, Professor Mangot. It's been a pleasure talking with you. Unless you have anything you'd like to add to our conversation, I would close our conversation now.
Well, thanks for having me. The only thing I want to say is, despite the fact that I try to be a neutral observer of the war, not taking sides, let me express my personal hope as a citizen that we will have an end to this war very soon.
I also express my hope that we will have peace very soon, especially living in Europe. We definitely peace on our continent. Thank you very much. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to another session of iGlobe Views. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Goodbye.